Thank you again, Governor, for joining us. We spent the morning talking about a range of energy-related topics, so I thought we'd kick it off with you to ask you to give us some perspective. We've seen in our country a dramatic increase in energy production over the past 5-6 years. So I want you to put that in context for what role should North Carolina play in that.
Well, I think the first major challenge we have with regard to energy, and I want to compliment the people who are helping with this presentation here today, is education about energy. Frankly, the energy acumen of this country is at a first grade level, because we learn about energy, frankly, through commercials, whether pro-energy or anti-energy or pro-whatever types of energy you want. In fact, I just heard today there's about to be a $2 million worth of ads against me in Asheville, Charlotte, and Raleigh on TV targeting fracking and coal ash. And it's political as opposed to educational. And we have got to educate our youth, we've got to educate our universities, we've got to educate business and the public about the pros and cons of every energy source, because every energy source that we're currently using, as we sit in this room, the energy source that helped make this chair or the chairs you're sitting in, or has helped heating or air conditioning this room, or got you to this event in your car, every energy source has a positive and negative. Every energy source. And they all have short-term and long-term ramifications regarding cost, regarding productivity, regarding exploration, and all regarding the disposal of the waste. And we've got to educate the public on energy. It's a major part of our life, but most people think it's all about turning on and off the light switch, when it's much more complex than that. The second major challenge I have is then the execution of a strategy. You're right. We can talk about all the above. The question is, how do you execute it? And how do you pay for it? And how do you plan for it? And how do you govern it? How do you oversee it? How do you use the money? What's the policy implementation? So energy is a very complex issue. I also split energy into two different subsets. One energy subset is power generation. You know, it's how do you run the generators, how do you turn on your lights for residential, commercial, industrial use? And the other is exploration, which really relates as much to transportation and the making of things and using oil byproducts and the many products that we use. And so I kind of divided into those two, although there is some overlap between those two. And of course, a lot of that is based upon the market, and the market has changed dramatically in power generation and energy exploration, especially with gas exploration, better known as fracking. That has changed the whole economic model of energy, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, and it's going to be interesting what the impact will be in the next 5 to 10 to 25 years, because to plan for energy, you have to literally plan 10 to 20 to 30 years in advance, whether it be a nuclear or coal or fossil, or even looking at wind and solar. There's a lot of hoops everyone has to jump through, and it's the long-term investments in capital that have got to be planned long in advance, and people are risking that capital, and we're all involved in that decision-making process.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about exploration. I would say probably the biggest issue for our area, the biggest thing being discussed right now is offshore drilling. And let's spend some time talking about the opportunities and risks for our region and for the state with that. So starting off on the opportunity side, one big opportunity is some type of revenue share. So can you update us on where that stands or what potential opportunities there are?
Let me first say, before we even talk about revenue share, we've got to find out what we have. And the debate about offshore drilling has been going on for 25 to 30 years in North Carolina in the political environment, but frankly, we don't even know what's out there at this point in time, and no one's checked. And I'm proud to say, as governor, during the past year and a half, that as I've chaired the offshore coalition of governors, we finally got permission, and I want to thank the President and especially Interior Secretary for giving us the permission to begin seismic testing offshore, to find out what do we have, because there hasn't been any type of testing for well over 25 years. And now the procedures and the processes are going to be more accurate, they're going to be safer, And we want to start that process hopefully within the next 2 years to find out exactly what do we have, where is it off of our coast, and what's the best way to access it. And the market's also going to determine where is it, whether it be natural gas or oil, which it gives us the best return, because some may be more difficult to get than others. And the way natural gas exploration is right now, they're going to go for the low-hanging fruit, which is easiest to get before they put further capital into those areas, which is more difficult to get. So my first goal is let's find out what we have off the coast of North Carolina. And then the second goal is once we find out, let's negotiate with the federal government, because right now there is no revenue sharing if we begin offshore exploration off the Atlantic coast, whether it be with Virginia, North Carolina, or South Carolina. I'm working with Terry McCulloch and Nikki Haley on this effort, and we're going to have to begin once we find out what's there. Then we start negotiating with the federal government on the revenue sharing. And we're literally talking some billions of dollars for our state in the next 15 years. And I hope we get at a minimum the same deal that the Gulf Coast states are getting in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas, that they're getting from the offshore, and then we can return to North Carolina. But right now, I spoke to the Interior Secretary about it about 3 months ago, who's very impressive, by the way. I'm very, very impressed with the Interior Secretary of the administration. She's very smart. She's got a business mind, and she's also protective of the environment. And she's got a good balance, and I'm very impressed. But I told her that, you know, we want to start, but we need to have a deal in place before we start.
So do you have a sense, assuming there is some type of revenue sharing with North Carolina, how would that come back to our area, or how does that affect
Well,
the
as
coastal
governor,
region?
yeah, once we get a revenue sharing agreement, and if hopefully it would be like the Gulf Coast, where literally we could be talking, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, I think I brought them a little bit here, but it'd be several $1 billion over a 17-year period, I think, are the estimates. Then the state legislature and the governor would have to determine where does that money go to. And I firmly believe that a fairly large percentage of that money should go to the coastal region of the Carolinas, because they're the ones who are investing in the infrastructure and actively involved. And they also have to sell the other industries, travel and tourism and others, that this will do no harm. And it's going to be a political battle. And I don't think it will, but I want to be partners with travel and tourism in this effort. And I think some of that revenue should be used for beach renourishment and also should be used for dredging our ports. And we constantly have dredging problems where right now the feds are following through on that, and the state of North Carolina doesn't have sufficient monies for that. But that's where I'd put the first amount of money, is to help the coastal Carolinas. I've got Frank Gorham here, who's the chairman of my Coastal Carolina Commission. And we've got major dredging issues and port issues and replenishment of beach issues, which are important to the travel and tourism industry. And I think that's where some of the money should definitely go to.
So obviously the big concern,
McCrory, it's pretty well known by everybody here that the Gulf Coast did not get a good deal out of the oil drilling that's been happening there. So what kind of deal are you talking about that we would get out of your business offshore?
so obviously there's many people in our community that have environmental concerns.
Her teleprompter's working. Now, listen, I welcome people who ask the tough questions, and I encourage dialogue, but what we don't need on all sides of the equations, because this is a complex issue. There are complexities of every form of power we use. But I'm telling you, if we want to continue to have the great quality of life that we have, the economic prosperity, and if you want to continue to create jobs, we better, in the United States, North Carolina included, we need to participate in our energy independence. And we have to do that. And for that individual or other individuals who will now get in their car and fill up with gas or turn on their air conditioner or heater, they're using energy from the same sources that they're protesting against. So.
All right. Well, let me ask one. I'm asking an environmental question here, so you might like it. So I'm going to keep going.
All right.
So how do you balance? Obviously, there's a lot of environmental concerns, whether you're yelling or you're sitting in the audience. So how do you balance those environmental concerns with, with the business interests? And, I think...
First of all, we have to be clearly upfront. Thank you, sir. First of all, we have to be clearly upfront with the benefits, the cost of return on investment, and we also have to be very upfront about the risk, and then make sure that we have measures in place, measures of policy, measures of implementation, execution, to limit or eliminate those risks. And that's what we have to have, very honest and direct conversations from both the left and the right on these energy issues. And right now, on the left and the right, we typically only have shouting or TV commercials as opposed to an intellectual discussion on the pros and cons of coal, the pros and cons of nuclear, the pros and cons of offshore drilling, the pros and cons of natural gas exploration, the pros and cons of hydro, the pros and cons of solar, the pros and cons of wind, and there are pros and cons regarding environmental, cost effectiveness, disposal, on every one of those. But to be naive and think that there is one solution that has no risk, that allows us to maintain the economic prosperity and quality of life that we enjoy here, is naive. Mm-hmm. And that's where the education has to be a part of the equation. And I frankly think industry, and I come from the utility industry, and I've told this to my colleagues in the industry, that in the last 10 or 20 years we quit educating the public on why do we need energy and what's it used for. And most people think it's only used for residential lights. And most people even think solar and power must now be 80 or 90% of our power, when it's less than 5%. But you wouldn't know that by what you see and read on TV. So it's not just for residential. If we're going to recruit major industry that make these furnitures, the chairs that we're sitting in, or to make steel, or to make cars, or to make computers, or to power your computers, we better have power that can meet the peak usage of everyone in this room at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a hot summer day, not only to help air condition your house, but to also turn on the generation that's needed to make Google work, your computers to work. It has to be reliable power, it has to be dependable power, it has to be safe power, and it has to be inexpensive power if we're going to be competitive. And those are the 3 or 4 challenges that we all have. It's very, very complex. When I recruit industry to North Carolina, one of the first questions they ask, I was with a major software company yesterday and another hardware company who makes automobile. They asked, what's your power cost? And if it's too high, they're going to go to another state. That's a major equation in addition to education needs, in addition to taxes, in addition to other infrastructure, is do we have affordable power?
I would say probably a lot of people here, obviously a lot of people live here because of the coast and the ocean and the river. Mm-hmm. And I think people's concerns are even heightened, because of what happened in the Gulf, because of, with an issue like coal ash, where you may not know for many years down the road what potential effects can be. So I would imagine the challenge for industry and the challenge politically and in terms of educationally is how do you weigh those concerns?
Well, first of all, you have to think long term. As we've learned from coal ash, just because you close a plant down, which we closed the Dan River plant down, the problem still exists. And you've got to make sure that we have people on top of that problem. But that's a problem that's been there for 60 years. And throughout the nation, this is not just a North Carolina problem. This is the coal ash issue is a problem throughout the United States and throughout the world. But we also have the nuclear waste issue. We're going to have issues with even solar and wind. What happens when they shut down? What do you do in the long term once you quit using them? So we can't just think the next 10 years. We've got to think what happens after you quit using this. And we've got to have that incorporated into the pay structure and to the cost, so there are reserves available to ensure that there is money for the long term to take care of it. Very similar when you buy a house, you better budget for when your roof starts leaking, as opposed to thinking all your payments are just in your monthly payments to your mortgage company. No, you better have other money for everything else, and we have to think of the same thing when it comes to power generation.
Well, let's spend a little time on the wind industry. We had some discussion earlier today with several folks in the industry, and the basic message was there's not going to be development of wind farms here, probably either onshore or offshore, as the current legislation stands. And that they can probably be more eloquent than I can in terms of explaining the reasons why. But is that your sense that right now we're stalled with having wind development, or you expect?
I think it's more of a cost factor at this point in time. And there are also some NIMBY factors. You know, everyone's for wind, but with every form of energy, I'm for this, but as long as it's somewhere else. And we see this in the mountains, we see this in the Piedmont, we see this on the coast of the ocean. I'm all for wind, but just don't make it outside my viewpoint where I have to see it. And, you know, again, I can relate that to every kind of power. I can relate that as a former mayor to where do we dump our garbage too. You know, everyone wants it. We have garbage, but I want someone else to deal with it. But right now, I think the main thing holding back wind is probably the cost, and that's partly due, and you're going to have to talk to the experts on this, is to the low cost of natural gas. And I think right now, because the low cost of natural gas is stalling some of the future development of other energy sources because it's a market factor. And that's also true with nuclear. You've seen some slowdown in nuclear because of the low cost of natural gas. And that's also allowed the shutting down of some coal plants because of the availability of natural gas. So thankfully we have it. In fact, North Carolina, Piedmont Natural Gas, Duke Energy, and Dominion just announced a major new gas line coming in from West Virginia, fracking, coming in, and it's going to have the potential to regenerize the eastern North Carolina economy, not only with new construction jobs. I think over 700, 800 new construction jobs just to build that in North Carolina, but parts of small towns in North Carolina do not have access to inexpensive power right now and don't have access to natural gas. And we see that natural gas line having a wonderful impact on all of eastern North Carolina, including right here in Wilmington. And that's very, very good news. But that's part of the natural gas explosion that's occurred, and I'm telling you, it's having a great impact also on our energy independence in America, which even goes to impact the Middle East policy and our policy with Russia and our policy with Venezuela and other people that we're relying on for our energy independence. So it even gets into international politics and peace and war.
So the energy providers are going to be required by about 2021 to have 12.5% of their energy sources come from renewables. Is it basically think we're going to have a mandated solution because the market forces, especially with natural gas, are going to steer there? Or, I mean, give us a sense of how you see renewables.
I think it's going to be a combination of things. We're seeing, for example, good news in solar. In many ways, solar at the beginning had to be heavily subsidized. The equipment was very expensive, and the implementation and execution was very expensive. But the technology and the cost are going down in solar, so the subsidies most likely will have to lessen. And there's a sooner or later, all the types of power generation are going to have to start standing on their own. But we also have to give these industries time. And that's what we're doing in North Carolina, trying to give them time, the investors time, to make it a revenue neutral or even a profitable business in the long term. If we don't give them a sufficient amount of time, we're not going to have the all-of-above approach that almost every politician says they're in favor of, but you have to give the science and the investment community and the technology the time to get that implemented. And I think that's going to be the big political question in North Carolina and our nation is how much time do you give the new sources of energy and subsidies time to get on their own feet, because we have to remind ourselves it is subsidized. You're paying more in your power bill to subsidize another form of power that we're experimenting with and trying to get into our grid. And in the short term, that's costing us more money. In the long term, hopefully, the consumer will benefit, and our environment will benefit, and our energy independence will benefit. And that's the goal.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Table 29, a question from Sarah. We'll get you Microphone.
Hi, I have a question about education institutions and research and developing more availability to materials regarding energy sources. So in regards to education about the energy industry, what educational institutions in North Carolina are involved in researching the impacts and benefits of various energy sources in North Carolina? And who is funding this research?
I think it's a combination of funding, but we've got some of our major universities actively involved in this. Primarily North Carolina State University is a major player right now in energy and trying to correlate what's our energy plan for the future. And I think who's funding it, you have funding some from the federal government, you have some funding from the industries, and you also have a great deal of funding from environmental groups on certain funding. In fact, I kind of, with all due respect to the environmental groups and frankly some of the industry, instead of spending money on political ads, I'd rather have the money spent on research and actual environmental cleanup. But right now, millions of dollars are being spent on the public relations as opposed to sound education and on research and on cleanup. And that's right now is going to be our biggest challenge, is where do we get the money from? And so I think our educational institutions from a technology standpoint will play a major role. I also, one thing I'm working on as governor, in fact I had a major meeting on this yesterday in Raleigh, we are, one of North Carolina's weaknesses, this is kind of a unique sidebar, is we've got to get more investors into the commercialization of our research that we're doing in our universities, whether it be in Wilmington or whether it be in State, Carolina, Duke, or UNC Charlotte or other areas where we get research money from the feds. We've got to convert more of that to commercialization, which will also create jobs and keep some of the energy jobs and medical jobs and other areas where we're doing research right here in North Carolina.
Good.
And I want to also say new tech is requiring high demand energy right now. All your computer usage is, it's requiring very high demand, and it has to be dependable energy, 24 hours a day. And Google, you know, just has a major place up in Hickory, North Carolina. Not a lot of jobs, but a lot of infrastructure, which is very important for North Carolina. And to keep that energy source going, we have to provide them low-cost energy, but more than anything, reliable energy. And that's also true with a lot of IT systems throughout North Carolina at this point in time. And most people just don't realize the energy usage that the new technology is requiring, in addition to manufacturing and other forms of industry.
Question from table 8, Jonathan?
Governor McCrory, thank you for coming to Wilmington so often. We really appreciate it and love having you here.
I love it here.
I think you're right that finding out what we do have offshore is important, and seismic testing should be, done right away. What is the environmental impact of just that seismic testing?
Let me just, I feel very confident that the new technology, I know you'll say some people will say that it may impact fish and other marine life. From all indications in my working with the federal government, it is very safe. They have procedures in place when they do it. They let the area of impact, the possible impact, know, and we'd be working with the Interior Secretary along with the energy companies who are going to invest in that very closely. So the state of North Carolina, the Interior Secretary under the current Obama administration, and myself and the companies will be working very closely, because the last thing I want to do is any harm off our coast, because I have other industries that are dependent upon our coast. The fishing industry, the travel and tourism industry, the shipping industry, and many others. And I have to work around that, even with our wind capabilities, and we have 3 or 4 great wind potential is in North Carolina, and I want us to keep promoting that. In fact, we got 2 major wind potentials right here in the Wilmington area, but I also have to work with our military to make sure it's not impacting any of our shipping channels. So as I look at, I've had a big map laid out in the governor's office, and looking at the high potential wind areas in North Carolina off our coast. And then I have the head of the military come in from out of D.C. go, yeah, that's good, but that's a shipping lane. You can't do it there. That's good, but no, you can't do it here. So we have to work around all the other infrastructure and transportation needs, military and commercial shipping lanes and things of this nature. So that's how complex this is. And then you've got the cost factor. Of course, the more difficult you make it, the more costly it gets, and then you have to compare that cost to other forms of energy, and then the investors step away. So that's the difficult process we all have to go through.
Yeah. Table 26, question from Jay.
Thank you. I work right next door at Cape Fear Community College. I'm the department chair for the Marine Tech program.
Right. You guys are doing a lot of research too on.
Excellent. That's exactly the point that I wanted to bring up. Our graduates go out and support the seismic industry, support our energy independence. The last couple legislative sessions, we've struggled with securing the funding that offers that specialized training. What advice would you give to us to help us navigate through this legislative session coming up in January?
Well, one thing I'm doing, and you kind of broke even in many ways because I changed the legislation. In one regard, they were cutting funding, but I was also rewarding those community colleges that have higher capital investment needs and research needs, but fewer students. You don't get punished for that. The old community college formula before I came into office was basically you got rewarded by how many people you teach, regardless of the cost of the course or the output. And therefore, we were encouraging the defunding of the more expensive courses that had fewer students but had a bigger return on investment. And that program that you have right here has a good return on investment and a high job return also for your graduates. Fewer people at a higher cost, but good return. And that's where I plan to reward the community colleges. And by the way, that's just not in your area, but that's with auto repair, that's with welding, that's with any technical IT type of training that we desperately need right now because that's where our labor shortages are in North Carolina. They're more expensive courses, they have fewer graduates, but the graduation employment rate is near 100%. We are rewarded by our formula those schools that do those types of programs. We were rewarding courses that were cheap to give, that had high volume, and frankly didn't have a better return on investment because the kids weren't getting jobs in those, learning those courses. Not that they're bad courses, the media always gets me on this, but you know, sociology courses and things are good courses, but they're cheaper to give, and frankly right now I have a higher demand for certain talent shortages that we have in North Carolina and our nation. And if we don't fill that talent demand, and your program, we're going to have that talent demand, especially if we begin the seismic testing process. And some good high-paying jobs, I might add.
Give us a sense of the competitive landscape for energy projects. I think we're used to hearing about, you know, economic development in terms of a company. Are they going to come to North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, somewhere else? I think North Carolina, you know, in talking with the folks from oil and gas industry and the wind industry are very attracted to North Carolina because we have the biggest coastline. But when you look at this in a competitive sense, which I assume it is, how do we compare with others on the Atlantic seaboard?
I don't think we know yet. That's why we've got to find out what we have in two areas. We've got to find out what gas and oil do we have, how hard it would be to get to, is it environmentally sound to get there, what would be the cost to ensure that, what infrastructure is going to be needed to transport it, what other infrastructure regarding piping and everything else would we need to implement it. We also have the same issue with inland gas exploration or fracking. Most likely, we do not know yet. No one's really tested, and most likely if we have potential gas, it's going to be in the Sandhills areas of North Carolina. And no one's looked. So we're going to try to do some test wells in the Sandhills areas on state property in an environmentally sound way. And if it's wet gas, we think the market will come very quickly because that's what's in demand. If it's dry gas, we're probably going to have to wait because we're going to be way behind the less expensive exploration in Pennsylvania or in Ohio or in West Virginia or in the Dakotas. And the market's going to go where they get the best return on investment. But again, if we don't go find out what we have, the market's not going to come here. I've met with, I've been to Houston and met with executives of some of the top energy companies, And they're bullish on North Carolina, but they're going to have to first see the data and then compare that data with other potential investments throughout the United States and, frankly, throughout the world.
The question at table 2 from Frank.
Frank, tell them your position and your responsibility and the pay that I give you for your position and responsibility.
Oh, I didn't know you were paying him. I'm not sure I would have called
Well, I
him.
cut his pay in half
All right.
today, I think.
Zero pay. Governor, you know,
Tell them your job, just for the audience.
I am the chairman of the Coastal Resource Commission, and I appreciate the trust that you put in us, and we hope we're going to make some difference in some of our coastal policies. Little different question. I have a son that was deployed 4 times. North Carolina, most people don't know this, is one of the biggest contributors to our military. We have so many young sons and daughters that go over there. People don't realize that my son probably wouldn't be deployed today because we are less dependent than we were 5 or 10 years ago. If you bring the offshore on, you're helping our kids stay home and not have to go there. And that's real important to us parents.
That's one of the main reasons I'm doing it, is because, frankly, the wars and the investments in those wars and conflicts and the loss of life more than anything else has often been over energy. And it's because we have been dependent upon others. And as an individual, as a country, the more you're dependent on other people, I think the less long-term sustainability you have. And we've got to recognize our energy independence, and I think we're hypocrites in North Carolina if we expect to get all our energy from somewhere else and just expect us to be, well, our hands are clean of this whole thing. No, we've got to participate in the energy independence. And not only that, but we need to create jobs for North Carolina. I'll mention one other thing about the military, is that we think this is a great potential for military members who are coming back home from Afghanistan and Iraq. We want them to stay in North Carolina. And our goal is to first help them get an education. And speaking of the community colleges, the legislature this year, and I'm very proud of this, we're going to be offering in-state tuition to anyone coming back home from Iraq and Afghanistan. They deserve it. And this is a talent pool that we're going to be using as a recruitment force for the energy industry and the IT industry and the manufacturing industry as a talent pool to fill the skills gap that we have in North Carolina and in the nation. And we think there's great potential there. There is one issue with the military that we've had to deal with regard to energy in and around some of our air bases. We've had to make sure the air bases are protected from potential infrastructure that could block the test landing and maneuvers of the military aircraft. So that's another balance that I've had to go to the Pentagon and discuss with top military commanders on what are we doing to protect Cherry Point and other bases from infrastructure that could make their job more difficult. And of course, I want to keep the military bases strong here in North Carolina because it's an important part of our economy. That's another balancing act that we all have. And sometimes that balancing act conflicts with each other. That's life.
Next question, table 30. Ray?
By the way, thanks for your son's service. God bless you and your wife also.
Governor, thanks for being here. I applaud the discussion today about all of the above energy sources. I think that's where we need to be. As a backdrop, I'm an engineer in water and wastewater, so I'll give you where this question's coming from. Noticeably absent to me in the discussion today is waste to energy, and I'd just like to get an idea from policy perspective where waste to energy is going to fit in North Carolina's energy future.
God, that's a great question. Well, again, first of all, we need more engineers like you. We have a shortage of engineers, and we need to start encouraging more engineering. That's one of our skills gaps at this point in time, and if we don't fill that skills gap in our nation and our schools and adjust our curriculum and even incentivize engineering, we're not going to be competitive in this area in North Carolina. And so, but as a former mayor, I know of this issue, and we've got to put a cost figure on this more to get a return on investment, and I think cities haven't clearly informed the public on how much capital investments they're making on wastewater and how we could reduce that investment if we could transfer that cost into energy and put that cost factor then into the cost of energy, into the subsidy, and put it all in one package. I'm talking out of my league right now, but I know enough to be dangerous, and I don't think we're doing enough selling on the return on investment of that, because we're not really explaining to the public how much waste there is and how much it costs. And we're all involved in that. And that's a major part of our water bill, is how to deal with the waste. And not only the human waste, and we have animal waste also in this state, but we also have the energy waste. And what's been exciting about technology is how, when you go to so many manufacturing plants, how they're taking advantage of the waste that we used to throw away and recycling that waste and converting it into energy. It's fascinating, because if you're in manufacturing right now, 1 or 2% can make a difference in your total net return on your profits. And if they can reduce their energy costs by 3 or 4 or 5%, that can make the difference on whether or not that plant stays open. And technology has allowed many plants to recycle elements that were thrown out, and they put them back in an incinerator and create new energy. And working with the utilities and others is allowing that, and that's very, very important. So it's a long process in talking about energy.
I want to make sure we touch on what is our role in this process. We've seen that the nation's energy supply has been transformed by what's happened to natural gas, and I think we have seen just in the headlines in the past 6 months so many different things happening in the energy arena in North Carolina, specifically on the coast. To an audience of business people and community leaders, there's going to be a lot of decisions made, whether we're looking to attract industry, whether we don't want industry, and what is our role in that process? How do you see that working? As you said, this is going to happen over a number of years. Sure. These are long-term decisions. How are we involved in that?
One thing that I think we have to do, and we've begun this process in the past years, we've got to present a 25-year infrastructure plan for North Carolina. We've got to show our public, we've got to show energy providers, we've got to show the industries that we have an infrastructure plan that is for transportation. And when I say transportation, we've got to show them where our future investments in ports will be, where our future investments in airports will be, and where our future investments in roads and rail will be. Because if we don't have the logistics of transportation, we're not going to get these new investments of even energy into North Carolina. And I'm very proud that Tony Tatum, my Secretary of Transportation, we came down here just a couple weeks ago and announced portions of our 25-year transportation plan. And we've got to show industry that we have plans for the future in transportation and infrastructure. And the second area of that is, I think we need a 25-year transportation plan, energy plan. We've got to show the public exactly where our energy is going to come from in the future. How much of it is going to be nuclear, how much of it is going to be coal, how much of it is going to be solar and wind and biotech and waste and hydro and all of the above. And also, which ways are we going to participate in energy exploration? Are we going to go after natural gas? Are we going to go after oil off our coast and natural gas? And communicate clearly where our investments are going to be. But again, that's a 25-year plan at a minimum, because these short-term investments, you won't know the return until the next generation. But that's how long it takes. But 25 years in the life of a state, as I learned when I implemented mass transit as a mayor in Charlotte, they're in the 18th year of the 25-year plan when I started it in 1996 or 97, whatever time period that was. And it goes by like that, just like that. I think I was 41 at the time. I'm turning 58 next week. And I go back home to Charlotte and I go, wow. That used to be a drawing, and now it's the real thing. But we had a plan on how to pay for it. We had a strategy to implement it. And we also had the public involved in the development of that plan. And the third, by the way, part of the infrastructure plan, and there's some more, is communications. we've got to tie in all parts of our state into a communications network. We have especially our rural areas of states that don't have broadband, and we aren't getting broadband access, and that also gives some limitations to industry if we don't have the communications infrastructure. And I'm working with the FCC on that right now, and we're trying to be a trial period for the rest of the nation for that for North Carolina. One other area is water. There are parts of the state that have gone through water shortages, and we have to make sure we clearly know where our future water supply is going to come from, not just for drinking water, but for industrial use and also for utility use, because water is a major need for energy also. And people just don't realize that. So those are 4 areas of infrastructure that we need to be thinking about, and the best way to present that is to develop the plan, develop the strategy, and then present ways on how to pay for it and get commitment from the public.
Well, we need to wrap up the program, but I want to thank you again for joining us. Will you please give the governor another round of applause?
Thank you all very much. It's an honor. Thank you.